First of all, name your enemy. Defence Strategic Review that was done a couple of years ago by this current government, they mentioned climate change as a threat 4 times before they mentioned China. But it is China, and it may not be just the fact that it's the communist, because this is a 1938 nationalist textbook map of what the Chinese at the time thought Greater China should be. It covered down to Singapore and well into Russia and so on. They have dreams of empire still. 87 years later, the map hasn't changed much. This is all the countries that have border disputes with China. But they didn't mention Russia. And a couple of years ago when Xi Jinping met Putin, he asked Russia to give Vladivostok back. To put that into context, this map shows the territories that Russia took from China in the mid-19th century. And that's what the Chinese want back in the first instance. But further to the south, this is their biggest impact on the world. This is what they claim as ancient Chinese territory, and they'll keep everybody out of it. You know, that's Vietnam, Malaysia and so on, and the Philippines. And there's no much commercial value in this claim. It's basically to stomp on their neighbours' faces to the end of time and lord it over them. If you want to have a feeling for what Xi Jinping's thinking is like, well, I won't read the whole of it, but except for this bit down here. This is the 19th Party Congress in 2017. He'd been elected as dictator in 2013. And he says, the wheels of history roll on, the tides of the times are vast and mighty. History looks kindly on those with resolve, with drive and ambition and plenty of guts. It won't wait for the hesitant, the apathetic, or those shy of a challenge. Xi Jinping wants to get a lot of history written in other people's blood. Some of it will be our blood. He wants to go down in history as a new yellow emperor, which is the modern equivalent of Hongdi of 2700 BC. And he's told the Chinese people to stop whining and to eat bitterness. But China has a number of frailties and fragilities, and they're not 10 foot tall, as the Indo-PACOM commander Paparo of the US said recently. First up is their food supply situation. This graph shows Brazilian soybean exports from 1964, US exports from 1964 up to 2023. And this black line is the Chinese imports. They basically hoover up all the world's soybeans that are exported to convert it into chicken and pigs. Otherwise, they wouldn't have any meat to eat. They were basically a purely vegetarian country up to about the year 2000, when this started taking off. And this is what the makeup of their grain and soybean consumption is. On the left-hand side, you see millions of tons of corn, rice, wheat, imported corn and soybeans. The percentages are the percentage of protein in each of those things. And on here, it's calculated out what the percentage of protein of the total Chinese diet each of those represent. And imported soybeans are 38%. Total imported protein of their agricultural system is 43%. Now, normally you would say that's going to stop you from starting a war because you can be so easily blockaded. He wants a war more than he wants his country to be fed. And it didn't stop the Japanese in World War II. The Japanese started World War II importing a hell of a lot of rice and so on from southern Asia, and thus Operation Starvation of B-29s dropping sea mines. The solution for the Chinese, well, let's go back a bit. Along comes the Ukraine-Russia war of 2022. Everybody expected to be over in a couple of weeks and life to go back to normal. They'd keep importing grain by sea quite confidently, but the war's now approaching the end of its 3rd year. If that happened to China, they would be starving. They've got about 700 million tonnes of grain in stock. But that would only last them a couple of years. So what's the solution? They're going to go vegetarian for the duration of the war. I remember reading an account of Chinese coal miners living in northern China back in the late 90s. And they only ate meat twice a year. Now, as opposed to ourselves in Australia, World War II, we ate meat with every meal, and there was an exhortation from the government at the time to have one meal a day without meat, and that would help the war effort. But they're going to go duration, they're going to increase grain production by 50 million tonnes per annum. To do that, Xi Jinping appointed 80,000 rural inspectors to go around ripping up orchards and everything else that could be converted to producing grain. And they've got an agreement with Russia to ship 50 million tonnes per annum across the Trans-Siberian Railway. And how do we know that a war is definitely coming? Well, one of the signs is the Chinese spent $7 billion Aussie equivalent to build a green belt around Chengdu in Western China and make it all civilised and everything. Then as soon as it was built, they bulldozed it again to put it under grain, and they'll produce probably 250,000 tonnes of rice out of that. China is a structurally poor country. They produce 100 to 200 million tonnes of rice a year, just about 95% of which is hand planted. Anybody who hand plants grains has a structurally low standard of living. There are 425 million agricultural workers in China. That's that number there. So each agricultural worker only feeds himself and 2 other people. Now, by comparison, in Western Australia, I'm told that there are wheat farms here that produce 100,000 tonne per annum with 3 full-time employees, which means that each of those employees produces enough food for 100,000 other people. Now, it's at the big end of the scale, but there are a number of wheat farms that are much the same. And traditionally in Western society, only 2% of the population's involved in agriculture and feeding the rest of us. Also, there's about 300 million people, no, there's 600 million people in China who still earn less than $141 a month. That's barely enough to put a shirt on their back after feeding themselves. We won't be fighting the full 1,300 million when they start their war. We'll only be fighting 300 million in the coastal provinces that trade with the rest of the world. Another problem coming up for the Chinese is their coal supply. It took off since about 2000. They now burn about 4.5 billion tonnes per annum of their own coal, import another 500 million tonnes. But if you look at their reserves, this is from a Chinese paper, their coal down to about 600 metres, 80% depleted, 600 to 1,000 metres at 60% depleted, and once you start going deeper, your costs rise. They've got about 130 billion tonnes of coal reserves left. They've burned through half of their endowment they started with, and according to resource extraction theory, costs should rise as you go through half of it. This is a Soviet concept of the correlation of forces. This is China with about 15% of world GDP, wanting to take over the world. Against them is the US and Europe and so on, India and East Asia, South Korea and Japan and so on. And all these people are indifferent. Let's look at East Asia in detail. So you've got the United States, about 22 trillion US dollar GDP. Here's the non-Chinese countries in East Asia, from Australia and India and Japan up there. And there's China as it sits now. Now, normally in the attack, if you want to attack somebody, you're going to have 3 times the force involved. China doesn't have 3 times the force. Japan could keep China at bay if they wish to. We could keep China at bay at a distance of 3,000 kilometres if we wish to. But let's look at the detail of the Chinese GDP. So that's the people on less than $141 US a month. That's about $1 trillion. They can only put a shirt on their back if they're lucky. Exports, which would cease as soon as the war started. Construction's been a big chunk of the Chinese GDP, about 30%. That would also stop. So the actual cash flow they can use for fighting the rest of the world is only about half of their total GDP. Now some figures on China's economy. China did rise. This goes from 2000 to 2023. China's GDP relative to the US in percentage. So it started off around about the 20%, 10% level. Over 20 years rose to 75% odd. But the last few years it's turned down, and this should turn down even faster now that Trump is back in charge of the United States. That's Australia's GDP by comparison. It's about 6% of the US GDP. Now, there has been a lot of foreign investment in China. This graph goes from 98 to 2024. They've been sucking money in from the rest of the world at around about $200 to $250 billion a year. It's now gone negative last year, so that's 250 billion US a year that's no longer gets to be spent in China, and all the foreigners are going to be busy trying to take their money out if they can, which they'll find difficult. The deal drought in China. Here we are in 2024, the number of deals it's actually in yuan, but it's now back to levels of 15 years ago, 10 years ago. Xi has killed the animal spirits in the economy. Property sales. Here we are from 2003, peaked in 2021, now coming off. There's been a big chunk of their economy, about 30%. This is the startups founded. Now, Xi has really killed the entrepreneurial spirit in China. So we're now down to almost nothing in 2024. And this is the biggie. The propensity to get married is an indication of how optimistic you are about the future. And these are the number of registered marriages in China from 2005 to 2023. It doubled from 2005 up to 2013 and then halved again. So 2013 was peak China in hindsight. And this explains why the birth rates dropped away. People get married to have children. If they're not getting married, they're not going to have children. Back to the property sector, there's two lines, floor space started and floor space sold. Now, one Chinese academic had a very good analysis of the whole thing. He said that China started off with this big endowment of coal. They've burnt it. Chinese worked very hard and they saved very hard. They got encouraged to put their savings into apartments, most of which won't ever be lived in. And in 50 years, those blocks will be torn down. So they effectively swapped their coal reserves that they were endowed with for a whole lot of concrete, which will then be turned into gravel in 50 years. Debt as a percentage of GDP. A lot of China's growth has been debt funded, and a lot on things that are loss making, like long distance high speed rail. They have a few rail lines that actually pay their own way, but most of them will simply rot from lack of use and eventually they'll be closed down. But they'll be left with the debt. Now, I saw this headline recently, everyone under Xi Jinping wants to escape. And I thought, well, that started with his own family. If you look at his closest relatives, his older sister lives in Canada, he's got his second sister lives in Melbourne, he's got a younger brother that lives in Melbourne, and his daughter lives in just outside Boston. She went to Harvard University, lives at Boston. So Xi Jinping's family fled the country at least 15 years ago. They were the first out the door. And then for the rest of the previous presidents of China, they all live in United States. Now, this is an interesting observation at the bottom. I have a friend who's got a very high security clearance in Washington, and he sent me this recently. Basically, that the CCP elders know that Xi's a crazed Maoist, and they've got him cornered, but Xi is still in control of the country. But he says here, some PLA leaders are willing to enter an unwinnable war so they can overthrow a discredited Xi. So it's a crazy way to run the world. Now, also be aware that the Chinese put a lot of effort into making sure there's a lot of animosity to foreigners. In China, there's at least 36 museums of national humiliation. This is the one in Shenyang, and it's made in the form of a desk calendar, open to the 18th of September 1931, which is the date of the Mudkon Bridge incident in China. They're basically picking at the scab to keep the wound fresh. As soon as Xi Jinping got elected dictator back in late 2012, he started baiting all the countries around. And this is a graph that's updated monthly by the Japanese Department of Foreign Affairs. And it shows Chinese incursions into the waters around the Senkakus. Until this graph goes to zero and there are no incursions, war is coming to Asia. This is the heartbeat of war in Asia. Why Taiwan will fight. Well, when the Russians invaded Ukraine, and some of the officers got killed, and the documents on them were examined by Ukrainian intelligence. They outlined their plans for how to run Ukraine. They're basically going to liquidate the elite and then send everybody else into re-education camps. All the people who didn't want to collaborate would be sent into Russia, and only collaborators would be left in Ukraine. Now, the same thing would happen to Taiwan if China invaded successfully. The elite would be killed off. So you might as well fight as die. And and the people who survive all that will spend an hour a day in studying Xi Jinping thought, as all the members of the Communist Party on the mainland have to do every day. They spend half a day studying Xi Jinping thought, and there's an examination at the end of the half hour to see whether you've actually done your work or not. And this is all run by mobile phone. And this is the weather windows into invading Taiwan. It starts in May, goes through to July, and there's another month on October. Otherwise, it's considered to be too windy to have a high chance of success. On that subject, invading Taiwan is going to be difficult, especially with current technology. So this is the latest plan the Chinese have, is to have these barges, self-propelled barges, that have legs. They jack themselves up on just offshore from the beach, and then they put this ramp out so that tanks can come ashore. These are ro-ro ferries. All Chinese car ferries now have reinforced decks so they can take 70-ton main battle tanks. That would then come up here, unload, and off they go. And these are the things under construction. This is a satellite photo from the 8th of January this year, and it shows 5 of these with the jack-up legs. You can see the white legs here and here, and they've got various lengths. And this morning came in these 2 images of, these are the jack-up legs. They've got twin pilot houses. There's the exhaust tacks, and this is the ramp that comes out onto the beach. Now, I've looked at a lot of satellite imagery, and I don't see that the Chinese have laid a lot of concrete for invading Taiwan, but they have laid a lot of concrete for invading Vietnam. So this is a base 10 kilometres north of the Chinese border with Vietnam, and they started building it around 2015. Originally these roofs were red, just as red as that, but they've faded in the last 10 years, as Chinese stuff does. And I've seen this thing grow from these original warehouse structures here, further down to here, as the years pass. And the idea of this thing would be that tanks and artillery and so on would come up here at night, not being seen by satellites, park up in here, the personnel camped here. There's no facilities, no training grounds or whatever. There's an army base just here, and we know it's an army base because it's got a running track. Just about every military installation in China has a running track associated with it. That's 10 kilometres from the border, so one night they'll get the order and they'll be on the border in a quarter of an hour. They've also built artillery pads just up on the border. And so this is on the Chinese side. You see these roads coming up to a turnaround circle. That's, you can have half a dozen artillery pieces here. They're a bit autistic in that this is a SAM site being built just 22 kilometres north of the Vietnamese border. It's an artillery range. And we know it's a SAM site because it's the structure. You have the pads for launching the missiles from, and this is a central ramp that the radar runs up on. And this is the running track under construction. How they'll invade Vietnam is, my guess is they'll use exactly the same routes they had in '79. The '79 invasion lasted about 3 weeks. They lost about 30,000 troops. But people aren't aware that they kept shelling Vietnam up till 1991. And while Deng Xiaoping has a mystique as being a good bloke, he knew that he had to blood Chinese troops, so he rotated military units up to the border so they could shell Vietnam, which was very embarrassing to the Vietnamese because they were a brother, heavily communist country, out to the South China Sea. The South China Sea might be a bit more complicated than you appreciate in that Vietnam alone has got 47 bases. This map doesn't show all of them. That's Palawan in the Philippines, that's Borneo, that's Vietnam over here. That's the Malaysian bases, the Filipino bases with their flag. The big yellow stars are Vietnam, and the smaller ones in the corner are China. China was late to it, so all the other countries got the proper islands. Vietnam built a lot of theirs on reefs, as we'll see. But I think the Chinese have made a big mistake in putting so much investment into these bases. And it's 1,000 kilometres from Hainan in the mainland. It's just off the mainland. It runs within a couple of 100 kilometres of the Vietnamese coast. The Vietnamese in the last few years have built a lot of radars along this coastline and building BrahMos and buying BrahMos supersonic missiles from India and so on. Which means this is a big kill box. When the war starts, they'll start up here invading Taiwan. Japan will be involved. It's very important to attack these bases and to take them over, because the Chinese will put inordinate amount of effort, waste a lot of effort trying to protect these things. And also a big psychological blow to the Chinese to lose territory, to start a war and lose territory. Especially when nobody wants to set foot in mainland China to end the war. This is a Chinese graphic of the airfields in the South China Sea. These are the ones on the natural islands owned by the other countries. This is Woody Island and the Parasols, and the three bases, 10,000 foot runways that the Chinese have. Now we'll go and spend some slides looking at some of the Chinese bases. They've got a wide variety of structural styles that they follow. This is what some of them look like. But in particular, they built these bases with these arms coming out, and the arms have got a kink in it so that the people out here can't be shot at by people on the ground facing out. They can still fire back at the structure. And I think that they deliberately reduced the size of these islands to make sure that everybody approaching them was still in the water, struggling in the water, could be more easily shot at. And then subsequently they built these hotel accommodation type islands. This is about 100 metres in each one of these. And that's probably the optimum distance for rifle and machine gun support, for mutual support between the two islands. And there's more of them. When the war starts, each of these little bases will have its own fate. But they're also protecting us to some extent, because it'll soak up effort that they would come and kill Australians, so pray for them. Now, and there's another humorous thing about this whole Vietnam-China standoff, in that China's been attacking Vietnam since 116 BC. And the Vietnamese, the Chinese are their biggest bête noire. And they know they will attack, because they've done it before, thousands of years of it. So Vietnam had always thought that as long as the Vietnamese economy was at least 10% of the size of the Chinese economy, they could keep the Chinese at bay. Along came the Chinese miracle from year 2000, and bear in mind that both countries were totalitarian communist dictatorships, and Vietnam was actually quite repressed. So the Vietnamese realised, well, to grow their economy, to hold of China, they had to free up the animal spirits of the economy. And so Vietnamese growth has now been still at 8% per annum, and they're growing very strongly still, as a lot of people are switching out of China to go to Vietnam. And having a much bigger economy means that they could do more to defend themselves. First thing they do is turn around, get some cutter suction dredges, and these residual bases, you can see here the original island, it's mostly covered in buildings, put the cutter section dredge into the middle of the reef, carve out a harbour, pile up the sand, and you've got a much larger island, which will make it much easier to defend, because you've got more place to build bunkers in and withstand the initial Chinese onslaught. And there's a few of them. One of this thing is now 4 kilometres long. They could easily build a very large airfield on this. So Xi looks at that, this is last year, and thinks, well, they're obviously not going to give them up for free. We're going to have to fight Vietnam. So he told his military to get ready for a maritime war. What's also interesting is that Tokyo is sending troops down into the Philippines to act as a tripwire force, so they will be involved in any battle that's coming. Now, most people might think that Coast Guards are all benign things, that they're out at sea saving people's lives. Well, the Chinese have flipped the script. They've built this particular Coast Guard vessel that weighs 12,000 tonnes, and they actually set it in print that it could sink a vessel of 5,000 tonnes without being harmed itself. So that's the idea that they have in their Coast Guard. They'll bully other people's Coast Guards out of the way and sink them if necessary. On the other hand, this is the Philippines. This is a vessel. It was originally a landing ship tank that was built on a shipyard on the Mississippi River in 1944, served well in the Second World War, distinguished service in the Vietnam War. When that was over, it took a whole lot of refugees to the Philippines, was given to the Filipino Navy. In '98, the Filipino Navy ran it up on Second Thomas Shoal, and since then, 12 Filipino Marines have lived on this as the vessel rots away underneath them. And the Philippines, of course, has to rotate their troops and resupply them. And from last year, about a year ago, this is a still from a video showing a Chinese Coast Guard vessel with a water cannon trying to fend off the Filipino supply ship. And a couple of seconds after this, that window is shattered and everybody gets covered in glass and seawater. Just how nasty are the Chi-Coms? Well, this is a long series of slides, so we'll get started. Involving Australian Defence personnel. So, 18th of November 2023, HMAS Toowoomba was in Japan's exclusive economic zone, got its propellers caught up in a net, so it sent its divers overboard to clear the net, and it radioed in the general area that we've got divers overboard, don't approach us. So of course, Chinese vessel, destroyer DDG-139, approached and blasted the divers with its sonar. We're told that none of the divers were permanently harmed. Then the year before, there was a Chinese destroyer just north of Arnhem Land, 65 k's north of our coastline, who used a military-grade laser to try to blind the pilots of a RAAF Poseidon. Now, I should mention to everybody that seemingly just about every Chinese vessel and military installation has military-grade lasers to blind enemy troops. So anybody serving against the Chinese should be wearing laser-proof sunglasses day and night. 3 days after this incident here, at an APEC meeting, that's our Prime Minister playing handsy with Xi Jinping. It's a vomit-inducing image, in my opinion. How nasty are the Chi-Coms? COVID. Well, COVID started in the minds of certain psychopathic elite. The science was actually done by a bloke called Ralph Barrick at the University of Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Gain of function, though, research was banned in the US. So they happily sent that off to Wuhan to be done, because Chinese labs can be guaranteed to leak. There was Chinese labs that leaked SARS virus 3 times between 2003 and 2017. So you know they were going to leak it. Anyway, the Chinese start making the virus, and the political leadership of the country were probably briefed on it all and what was expected to achieve. When it leaked in Wuhan, Xi Jinping shut down all travel into Wuhan, but he allowed international flights out of Wuhan to other countries, most of which went to Milan because there was a big contingent of Chinese people involved in the fabric industry in northern Italy. So that's why the European outbreak got centred in northern Italy, and quite a lot of elderly Italians promptly died as a result of that. Now, China is particularly poorly set up to hold off COVID. He tried having a lockdown situation for about 3 years, then the whole country started to revolt. He also made the provincial governments pay for the lockdowns. When their debt was running too high and they couldn't raise any more money, he flipped to let it rip. 2 to 3 million elderly Chinese promptly died. And China is poorly set up to hold off this virus because in northern China, the average vitamin D level is 13 nanograms per mil in summer and drops to 9 nanograms per mil in winter, along with apartment living, which means you share a lot of air with other people. The Johnson South Reef edition of just how nasty the Chi-Coms. This is a still from a Chinese camera from 88. And that's 76 Vietnamese sailors, unarmed sailors, standing on the reef at Johnson South Reef in the Spratly Islands, just before they all got machine gunned by the Chinese, and they all died. And that's a Vietnamese memorial to them. What have the Chinese done with the island since? This is the reef, it's 4.3 kilometres long. They built a base about 400 metres square. So their style was you get a cutter suction dredge, come in, dig all this up, create a little harbour, pile up the sand and build on the sand. This is a satellite photo from 2015 showing the then state of the base they built. And what's interesting is that after 70 years, it's now 80 years, but 70 years then, flak towers make a return. The way they built this thing is seemingly there's no entrance at ground level because they're too afraid of special forces coming ashore, blowing the doors and taking over the thing. So to get into the whole thing, you've got this ramp, then a guardhouse, and then you're into the main building. This is a more recent one on Quarteron Reef. What we see here in the morning in the corner is a close-in weapon system. That's a radar, that'd be an autocannon, probably 30 millimetres. That's the main building with the little towers on the corners. There's another similar close-in weapon system over here. And this is the one on Gaven Reef. 4 flak towers, that's 100 metres to give you an idea of the scale of this structure. 4 flak towers in the corners so that they can fire back at the building if it's being assaulted. They've got the ramp, there's the guardhouse, solar panels, and what you see here in the water is the Chinese went through a phase of dredging all the coral off the top of these islands, dead and alive, and you crush it up and you send it back to China to be a plastic filler. But it was one of the bigger ecological disasters on the planet at the time, but a lot of islands in the Spratlys have had this done to them, most of them. This is on Mischief Reef. Now they've got 3 islands which are much larger. They're atolls, some of them, including Mischief Reef. That's a 10,000 foot runway. Those are for fighter aircraft, ready alert. This is the harbour entrance at Fiery Cross Reef. All those are communications facilities. And this is a channel dug by cutter suction dredges. That's Mischief Reef again, with a hell lot of masonry structures. Now bear in mind when you look at photos of these places, you can't see any person, you can't see any cars. It's probably too expensive to keep people out on these islands for a long time. And Fiery Cross Reef again, that's a Chinese AWACS plane. And there's a lot of masonry structures to attack when we have to attack these bases. Organ harvesting edition of just how nasty are the Chi-Coms. China is a big tourism transplant destination on the planet, where they have a lot of kidneys, livers and hearts. Now the strange thing about hearts is normally you don't get a heart unless someone's died, but in China you can say this is my blood type, and then they'll go through the records and see if they've got someone they can take the heart out of. And they've got a process called, well, it was developed in the West but the Chinese use it, called extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, which allows them to harvest up to 4 organs per individual that they're killing in this process. Kidney transplants shot up, more than doubling once the persecution of Falun Gong started. Australian connection, there's a bloke called Yang Hengjung, naturalised Australian. He was told, no, don't go back to China. He went back to China, got arrested, was given a suspended death sentence. So what do they do with prisoners in China? They give them a suspended death sentence. When they get an organ match, then they kill them and take the organ out. So that means anybody trading with China is supporting this practice, even if you don't mind all the other things they're up to. And RC, they made 14 demands of the Australian people a few years ago. Back in 2020, the Chinese embassy made up this list of things that we're supposed to do to not be so offensive. And that, the historic analogy that's opposite is the Japan's list of 21 demands made on 18th of January 1915 against China. Now 16 years later they started that long war and a lot of people died. Bhutan likes to think of itself as the happiest kingdom on the planet. So happy. China decides to take chunks of Bhutan. So far they've stolen 2% of Bhutanese territory. There's not much the Bhutanese can do about it. But this map shows the territory they've stolen, and what they do is they build roads into it from the north and build these villages. There's no commercial purpose to these villages. You'll see that this is up in this territory here. There's only trees growing around. There's nothing you could make here that was worth transporting 3,000 kilometres to the coastline where you might sell it. This is only to stomp on the faces of the Bhutanese. India edition, 2020 in June. China thought that Indians get a bit uppity, so they thought they'd have to do a surprise attack on Indians in the Galwan Valley. And this was flagged by the Politburo level in Beijing a few weeks before it actually happened. Now, everybody's on the India-China border is unarmed, because otherwise they'd be shooting each other and that could escalate. So what the Chinese did, they got a number of star pickets, got bits of rebar, welded them on to use as clubs. They'd be able to overpower the Indians. Well, the Indians got upset and seized a lot of these clubs off the Chinese and counterattacked into the Chinese camp, scared the bejesus out of the Chinese. Now, 20 Indians died, perhaps 100 Chinese died in the counterattack. And as a result, the Indians thought, well, better get some countermeasures going in case this happens again. So this is one solution they came up, a trident, an electric trident, patterned on Hindu mythology of Lord Shiva's trident. The fentanyl crisis. There's a report you can find on the net, and it's got this paragraph in it, that basically the Chinese government removed VAT from the fentanyl precursors made by these chemical plants in China that'll be exported to Mexico and Canada to be made into fentanyl and then sent across the border into the United States. So they wanted to encourage fentanyl exports as much as possible, including in their own tax structure. Right at the moment, Trump has said to Canada, you stop the fentanyl exports across the border or we'll slap a 10% tariff on Canadian goods into the United States. But the Chinese, I think it's 250,000 Americans have died since 2018, that's 7 years, and 73,000 died in 2022 from fentanyl overdoses. Why anybody puts up with this, I don't know. Now, a big mistake in some of the wars of the 20th century was having a bad peace, having the wrong document signed. The Versailles Treaty, for instance, meant that Germany attacked again. It loaded Germany up with so much debt that caused all the problems they had, and we had another go. So the Chinese have to be discouraged from ever attacking again, but they've built these islands which can't be unbuilt. Someone else has to get them, and this is my stab at what the peace document would look like and who gets what. And those are the islands in question. That's Palawan in the Philippines. There's Bugsuk. The Americans got access to a base here and up here, and the Marines up here. And that's 200 kilometres. So they're all within current ballistic missile range of Palawan. Now, the Chinese have decided to threaten everybody with nuclear attack. And this is a still from a video of a couple of years ago that was on the Chinese internet briefly. And it basically says to Japan, you get involved in our attack on Taiwan and we'll nuke you one city a day until you unconditionally surrender. And then we'll divide Japan up with Russia and you'll be run as a subsidiary to the end of time. Now, it's wise sometimes to take people at their word. This is an official Chinese government video that they put out as a signalling exercise. What are they going to nuke them with? Well, they're building new ICBM fields. This is a satellite photo of the command facilities for an ICBM field being built here halfway to the western border. That's probably 1,500 kilometres west of Beijing, the obligatory running track. Now, fortunately, an inspection last year of some of these ICBM fields found that the fuel tanks on some of the missiles were full of water instead of fuel. And also there was one entire ICBM field where the lids on the silos couldn't open far enough for the missiles to fire. Now, that means they've got to pull out every missile, check everything, fix everything up. That might take them 2 years. We've got 2 years of grace, perhaps. How are they going to build the new warheads? Because they're going from 300, what they've had historically, to beyond 1,500 warheads, and adopting a nuclear warfighting stance instead of just having a retaliatory strike stance. Well, have built one and building another one. These are plutonium breeder reactors for making weapons-grade plutonium. The plutonium you can extract out of commercial fuel rods for commercial nuclear reactors when they're pulled after 3 years, is about 20% plutonium, Pu-240. Well, the plutonium is 20% Pu-240 and the 80% Pu-239. Weapons-grade plutonium has no more than 7% Pu-240. So you need specialised reactors to make it, and that's what they've done here. The Russians supplied the technology, and they also supplied the fuel load to get these things started. Well, the American or the US Marine Corps doing about China, they've decided they're no longer a land fighting force. Their role is to support the US Navy. The US Navy's next big war is going to be against China in the Western Pacific. So they decided to park up all their main battle tanks, most of their artillery, and their role will be to sit on those islands in the Western Pacific and fling missiles at the oncoming Chinese ships. Unfortunately, they've chosen this one, particularly inappropriate, because a land-based range of 200 kilometres. If you let a modern warship get in within 200 kilometres of you, that's not a good position to be in, because they could whack you just as fast as you can whack them. And that's part of the curse of the F-35, which we'll get to later. When the F-35 came along, it was obvious to some people that it was going to be a big seller, no matter how good it was or how bad it was. And the F-35 has this little bomb bay in it that's 4 metres long to hold 2 2,000-pound bombs. So a Norwegian weapons company called Kongsberg decided, if we make a cruise missile, an anti-ship cruise missile, that fits in the bomb bay of the F-35, we'll have the market to ourselves. So they created this naval strike missile and a land variant called the Joint Strike Missile. An expensive little thing with a little warhead and a little range. So that's part of the curse of the F-35, that this thing has been a big seller, including to our own armed forces. When dire things portend, we ask ourselves, what does the Bible say? If we go to Revelations 12:3, it says this: "And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his heads." Well, in 2009, the Standing Committee of the Chinese Communist Politburo was 9 people, and they cut it down to 7, no doubt to properly align with biblical prophecy in having 7 heads. And does it tell us how the war is going to end up? Well, if we go further on Revelation, it says, "And the great dragon was cast out." So we win. Our path is righteous, but God helps those who help themselves. The more we do to stop China now, the fewer dead we'll have. Also spiritually within China, in 2023, there was a 300% increase in young people, 20 to 30, visiting temples and lighting joss sticks. And after a particular Chinese Communist Party meeting called the 2-session season in March last year, there was a noticed uptick in the number of revenge on society attacks. These are people attacking kindergartens with machetes and the like, and also using sedan cars and trucks to run over people. So a couple of months ago, there was a Chinese bloke who killed 50 people and wounded another 40 odd, and people collected outside in calisthenics. But that's due to their feeling of helplessness when they give up. That goes into the spiritual battle in Ukraine. So on the left here, we have a Ukrainian Orthodox priest blessing a HIMARS launcher. And on the right, a Russian Orthodox priest blessing a logistics vehicle going to the front in Ukraine. Now, there are a lot of lessons from the war in Ukraine. We won't go through the detail, but I'll take you through the images. They give you a flavour of it. But because the evolution of electronics has favoured the defence, which is a good thing, because that's what we'll be doing, the whole Ukraine war is bogged down with a whopping great 5 kilometre to 10 kilometre wide no man's land. Everybody can see what everybody else is doing. Everybody's flinging things at each other. One of the things that drones can do is drop mines at night on Russian roads, Russian tracks. So this is an anti-tank mine. It's explosively formed projectile, which means the reason why it's got this hollow here is that's a big lump of copper. It's also got magnetic fuse. You don't actually have to run over it or touch it for it to go off. This might be set off by a tank a metre away, and that becomes a supersonic blob of molten copper at 2,000 degrees odd and punches a hole in whatever's passing. The Ukrainians have also put thermite dispensers on their larger drones. Now, large drones are too easily shot down during the daytime, so they're only used at night. And that burns at 2,000 degrees centigrade, so they run along the trench lines hoping to set a fire to all the woodwork in the trenches and burn everything up. And it works. Just, this is a warning to don't put your faith into one thing, in that this particular drone, and these are laser-guided missiles here, was very useful to the Azerbaijanis in their war against Armenia in 2020. And the Azerbaijanis won. Normally the Armenians won, but the Azerbaijanis won this time because the Armenians weren't ready for this thing. And this appeared in the Ukraine war. Turkey gave Ukraine a number of these, but eventually they dropped them pretty quickly because they got shot down on average after 3 days. 2.5 million per drone. It wasn't cost effective. Now the Ukrainian drone use started picking up in mid-2003 and then continued rising thereafter. They're now producing in excess of 100,000 drones a month, mainly in little garages and workshops. Everybody's got their own 3D printer, and they put them together and send them off to the front. But there's a bloke online called Andrew Perpetua who goes through all the losses every day on both sides, the video images, figures out what's been destroyed, annotates it, and this is available every day. And this blue is the Ukrainian losses on this particular day, the 28th of December last year. 80% of these are drone attacks. Everything is basically 80% were drones, not artillery or anything else. It's big. And the Ukrainians now, for some of their attacks and operations, apply just as many drone operators as infantry. That's how important it is to have an overwhelming drone presence on the battlefield. And this is from an American drone producer. That example of his infrared camera and the daylight camera. So you can detect people with this little thing at 8,200 feet or 7.5 miles, and that's a car same distance. And about a quarter of the distance at night. The whole problem of having to reassemble them on the front line, that is, the Ukrainian drone operators attach an explosive to the drone, make sure everything works and so on. That's not how Western militaries work. Everybody wants a solution out of a box. So this is another American solution. This is drones stacked with these guides. So you just open the box, they fly out and do their thing. They're already pre-programmed. And that's a concept called Hell Hive. There's another interesting concept. This is called bat mode. So that's the drone there. It goes along to the front line. There's nothing to see at the moment, but it wants to wait for the Russians. So to save power, it's got this hook here, attaches it to a branch, if one's appropriate, and just sits there with only the camera operating and just in stare mode, waiting for a Russian to turn up. Then if they see someone they want to attack, this drone will drop down from these guides and then go off and do its thing. Now, to date, most of the drones in this war have largely been radio controlled of various frequencies. And so you can jam them if you put enough effort into it. So this is a Russian logistics vehicle, Buhanka, or otherwise they're called Scooby-Doo vans. And these are the size of the jammers installed on the roof to make sure it survives its trip out to try and resupply the front line. If you've got jammers, you want to know if they're working or not. So you have a jammer detector. As well as having a drone detector, you have jamming detection to see whether your own jamming is working. We're also now switching to fibre optic filament. That's something that the Russians started last year, and then the Ukrainians have been big adopters of fibre optic drones, and the Russians have been close followers. This is an example of infrared in daylight, Ukrainian daylight in winter, and people still show up against the background of the forest, which enables the daylight camera to hone in on what it sees. And that looks like a North Korean sitting against a tree. The Russians have run out of a lot of things, and they're now heading to the front line on electric scooters, amongst other things. They've also converted a lot of their tanks. Because of the omnipresent drones, there aren't that many tank-on-tank battles anymore. Now, basically, the Ukrainians have been waiting for the Russians to come to them. So the barrel's useless, because you're not having a tank battle. So better for the whole thing to survive by putting it in a cage. That's one of the better jobs. Also be aware that the Russians are now at a late stage of the battle in which they're sending the walking wounded back to the front line. So these are blokes issued with one assault crutch, and one walking stick. And there are actually videos of Russian assault groups, about half a dozen people, crossing a field just with walking sticks and being attacked by Ukrainian drones. And the Ukrainians are making the bodies bounce. They really want the Russians to die. And here, this is a Russian saying, Russian warriors, so we have a walk to the front. Some people are quite adapted to operating drones, and this is from last year. This is a 20-year-old Ukrainian medical student whose call sign is Darwin, who is wearing his FPV goggles, controlling a drone, who's said to have killed hundreds of Russians. Now, while FPV drones are still big, you can try and reserve yourself to some extent by having your own personal jammer, which is up to the limit of basically what people can carry on their backs. And it basically destroys any other combat utility you have in terms of your carrying load. So that's, I don't know whether he's Russian or Ukrainian, he's got 6 antennas coming out of his back. And here's a Russian one, the size of his backpack. Bear in mind that's batteries and all the other stuff. There's 6 antennas out. We know he's a Russian because he's got a Russian flag on his helmet. And this is Ukrainian, very similar setup. And those fans are for cooling. You also have ground drones, and these are ones armed with machine guns. And this particular style has been quite popular. It's called the Rat LS. That's a little antenna. It's radio controlled, and this is used for 2 things. You can put an explosive charge in the middle of it, and then it runs along the ground and then tips into the enemy trench and explodes. Or you have a little structure above it, and this will drop about 3 anti-tank mines wherever you place them. So you're not exposed to enemy fire as this thing goes out and rebuilds the anti-tank defences. Also be aware that this is an American technology that's a few years old now, but the Ukrainian Special Forces use it. So the binocular enhanced night vision goggles. So it's 2 wide aperture thermal cameras, images, and the artificial intelligence picks out the human bodies and provides an outline for you. So this will greatly speed up your detection of enemy troops. That's a Russian drone detector, because a lot of the time you hear them before you see them. And if you have a drone detector, that can indicate the things close by. In fact, there was one Russian car driving along. It had an antenna linked up to a video, and it saw the video feed of the car itself being filmed by a Ukrainian drone, which they intersected. So they drove off the road very quickly. This is the switch to fibre optic. So that's what a fibre optic looks like compared to twigs and grass and so on. It's just basic glass. FPV drones traditionally have been limited to 10 kilometres, but if you actually had a relay drone up in the air, you can go to 20 kilometres, relay the image back. These fibre optic drones now have range up to 41 kilometres. Now, 10 kilometre filament weighs 1.35 kilos, so every kilometre you add to your range, you're taking off payload. That takes 100 minutes to wind on a spool, inside one of this. And that 10 kilometres of filament costs $386 US, basic Chinese suppliers. Fibre optic drones will be about $100 more expensive than FPV radio controlled drones. But you're unjammable, and you've got no idea that they're coming. This is a traditional Russian strike reconnaissance complex they started the war with, that this unmanned aerial vehicle with a camera underneath would find targets for the Lancer drone. The reason why it's got this X-wing is that at low speed that provides a lot more manoeuvrability. More recently, the Ukrainians have been able to adapt FPV drones to intercepting these things, and they've taken out about 850 in the last couple of months, which means there's less demand on the Ukrainian missile defence. Bear in mind the FPV drones can get to 200 kilometres an hour in about 2 or 3 seconds. This is an American concept that's been trialled in Ukraine. That's a man for size. It's also 2.7 metres high, wingspan of weight at 57 kilos. Resistant to electronic warfare, goes up to 6,100 metres. That's after a mission in Ukraine. And I find this quite instructive, that thing started out 40 kilometres behind the front and travelled 100 kilometres into Russia. It picked up 11 Buk anti-aircraft missile launchers, which were then subsequently targeted by HIMARS missiles. This is a smaller concept of the same sort of structure from a German company, the Helsing 2 Karma. Takes off vertically and then flies horizontally. 100-kilometre range, and Ukraine's getting 3,500 of these early this year at some stage. Now, the importance of this is, we'll see later on, that there are now underwater vehicles that could come up to our coastline here, open their doors, these things will pop out and they'd go 100 kilometres inland and pre-programmed. This has got AI terrain following and AI target recognition. There are no humans involved. It could recognise a truck or a tank. You could program it to run down a highway and attack certain types of trucks, for instance. So one of these surfacing off Perth, say 20 kilometres out, no one would know it was there, launch these things, they would attack all of the aircraft at Pierce, all the civilian aircraft at Perth Airport. We wouldn't be able to do anything about it. Also, some of the drones are small and some are quite large. Some of the larger drones can drop bombs weighing 40 kilos. This comment online says actually most of the damage to the Russians is done at night by these larger drones, which are octocopters and hexacopters. And what also the Ukrainians are doing is they're getting a drone during daylight which will drop a beacon, and the beacon's half the size of a cigarette pack, and one of these larger drones will come along and drop a big bomb on it in the middle of the night where the beacon's lying. And in terms of the exquisite control you have, this is a Russian tank barrel in the infrared taken at night. One FPV drone flew up to it and then had a shape charge which blew a hole in the barrel here, came right up to it. And then another FPV drone with a thermal camera came along and examined the damage. So that barrel can't be used anymore, and that tank is out of action until the barrel's replaced. And the Russians can only make 200 barrels a year at the moment. In terms of the countermeasures, what we've seen to date, this company called Leonardo got a Striker vehicle, a US Army vehicle, it's quite common, added these things to it, 30mm cannon, 26 kilowatt laser, 4 laser guided missiles, but these are 70 grand each US, 100 grand Aussie, in this launcher here. And it's got radars on the corners, and it probably protects out to about 5 to 8 kilometres. Fliers in the UK, the UK offshoot of the French company, made up this thing. It operates as a microwave and it shoots out in a big cone, but this thing is very poorly survivable on the battlefield. Go back to this thing. When it's not being used, this ducks back into the vehicle because optics are so easy to take out. There's an Australian company has got a solution, Electro-Optic Systems, based in Canberra. They do make a lot of remote weapon systems, so this is not much of an upgrade for them. They simply added a radar to it with a camera, and it's got a range of beyond 800 metres. It weighs almost 400 kilos. You stick on top of your vehicle. Then next up from that is a laser. That's a laser over here. That's the radar, the camera. An effective range of 2,000 metres. Electro-Optical Systems has also kindly offered this graphic of how to counter drones, and so you can calculate drone cost effectiveness trade-off. So 7.62 minigun will get you 500 metres, auto cannon will get you 800 metres, the chain gun with a longer barrel will take you out to 1,500 metres, then you've got a laser which goes to about 2 kilometres, and passive electronic jamming goes out to 5 kilometres. The radar will detect drones starting at 10 kilometres out. But bear in mind, every time you use a radar, the enemy can detect you at twice your detection distance. So if you can detect drones at 10 kilometres, an enemy EW suite will pick up your location 20 kilometres away. And they triangulate, and they know exactly where you are, and next minute you've got something incoming. And that's their day camera can detect things out to 4 kilometres, I think, and the thermal slightly less. But that's the sort of situation you're up against. Back to the war in Ukraine, it's good to start with a lot of barrels and a lot of artillery shells. Russian barrels last about 2,500 rounds before they blow. The Western ones tend to last up to 4,000 artillery shells. There are a lot of M777 barrels blowing up in Ukraine where they've shot Fermi rounds through them, and the Yanks are now struggling to build more barrels to replace them for themselves. But the Russians can only produce 200 barrels per annum. If they last 2,500 rounds each, that means they can only fire at a steady state, 500,000 rounds per annum. They have the ability, and they have been making 3 million artillery rounds per annum. This is an example of how they've basically emptied out all the things they built during the Soviet period. There's an artillery park in Omsk in May 2021. There's 1,300 howitzers. 2 years later, they're all gone. And as they ran out of artillery barrels, they switched to using more Su-34s, dropping glide bombs from within the Russian lines, and these things glide 50 to 70 kilometres before hitting a Ukrainian position. And accurate enough to be a real problem. And this is 2 years ago now, they were pulling out T-55s out of Siberia in storage and sending them to the front. And that's a design that's now 80 years old. Now, there have been other wars going on in the world. One is in Myanmar, where the rebels are fighting the government again. The rebels have their own bases out in the jungle where they've got 3D printers. They made some very large drones, dropping very large payloads. It's quite inspiring. And this is another Myanmar rebel. You can see it's actually quite lush. These are 10 drone launcher with the bat-shaped things. That one there you can see is taken off from down here, and this one here has just come from there. They've got enough thrust to get themselves off these little arms and get themselves flying and attack the government forces. If the Myanmar rebels can do it, we can do it, hopefully. What's the best in tube artillery systems? What Ukraine has shown is that towed doesn't last very long because it sits there. Both sides have got very good counter-battery radar, and you'll get incoming return fire within 3 minutes. And it's very difficult to pick up a towed artillery piece and get it moving again. What has been shown that wheeled is better than tracked, better than towed. These are examples of wheeled things. Plenty of other countries have got similar sort of thing offerings. Russian medical logistics. It looks very similar to scenes from the World War I, except now in colour we can see the colour of his underpants. This is a dead Russian. The wheel's flat. Russian command actually doesn't care much. In terms of the air war and what it means for us, what's going to happen from here. Well, air power theory was vindicated. The better side, the bigger side did win and Ukraine lost. But the good thing is that both sides find it too dangerous to overfly the other country's territory because they've both got very good SAM systems, anti-aircraft missile systems. That's a Russian Su-35 and it tends to fire the R-77-1 to 110 kilometre range. But it has vindicated air power theory in that the larger force will win, the air war will last 3 days, determine the size of your air force after the air war, calculate how many you'll lose using a loss exchange rate using Lanchester equations. We'll get to Lanchester equations later in the presentation. And also, if you use longer range air-to-air missiles, you'll push away the enemy aircraft. So that's some of the major air-to-air missiles in the world at the moment. And recent addition of the US SM-6, which is a anti-ballistic, anti-aircraft to be fired from ships. And it turns out it's got a number of uses. It can be used to shoot down ballistic missiles in that route. But recently fired as an air-to-air missile, it's got the longest range of all, of 620 kilometres, because it weighs so much. And also this vehicle, this aircraft became very useful, firing this missile, the R-37, 400 kilometre range, and that shot down a lot of low-flying Ukrainian aircraft well into Ukrainian territory. This thing, the Russian SAM-400 radar system and missile system, that's what it looks like standing up, and it folds down like this to be mobile. It can see out 600 kilometres. It only got introduced in 2018, and it shot down Ukrainian aircraft 150 kilometres away, flying just 15 feet off the ground. And we had lock-on at apogee. After the missile had been fired, there was told where the target was and to lock onto it, and so it did. That's what the Ukrainians mostly used. It's the book SA-11, first service in 1980. And this thing is the SA-5, first entered service in 1967, has had the longest range shoot down in Ukraine war to date, 305 kilometres. And then it hit a Tu-22, which flew on another 300 kilometres before crashing in Russia. But don't throw out your old stuff, which a lesson our Army and Air Force should be following. Helicopters, in my opinion, are too easily shot down near the front to be useful. And that's early in the war. Russian helicopter got hit here by a man-pad. Someone on the ground firing a little shoulder-fired missile, and it crashes over here. Dispersal is very important to survival, and you should practice taking off from highways. And why I included this one is the Ukrainian Su-27 practicing dispersed operations back in 2020. It almost ingested a road sign. And that's why it's important to practice in peacetime. We can get over these problems. Cruise missiles have been big in the war. The Russians have shot a lot of them off, but actually a lot of them get shot down too, which is a lesson for us. There's a bigger one, and I thought this was quite good at the time when I came across it. 450 kilo warhead, 5,000 kilometre range, which means if it took off from Darwin, if you fired it in the Timor Sea, you could hit southern China in the coastline and start taking things out there. But once again, the Ukrainians have shot down most of these. I haven't been able to shoot down many Iskanders, which is a 500 kilometre range, 700 kilo warhead, solid fuel, single stage. Not all that accurate, nevertheless, 4.6 tonnes, 3 million. That's US $652 a kilo, a reasonable price for something like this. The only thing that shoots things down is the Patriot batteries that the US has supplied, and some of the European countries have supplied Ukraine. Oh, back to numbers. Previously, the Russians were only able to build about 40 of these a month, and 40 a year. They are now up their rate of production to 40 to 50 a month, 30 to 50 the calibers. That's the thing with wings we saw a little while ago. And 50 of those on the previous page, that's a KH-101. Still making these. Ukraine's actually throwing more high explosive at Russia by cruise missile now than the Russians are throwing at Ukraine. 82 one-way attack drones a day and 8 cruise missiles a day. And that's why there are so many explosions in Russia now as they take out their oil fields. And now that the Biden regime has exited the stage, the Ukrainians are now attacking Russian power stations and substations, so whole cities can go dark. Iskander, which is the thing we just see, uses penetration aids to get through the radar coverage. And that's an example of one they use, puts out 6 of them, so the radar return blooms. But it didn't help. There was a Patriot battery in Kiev at 3 a.m. on the 14th of May 2023. The Russians fired 18 missiles to arrive in a 2-minute period, and the Patriot battery shot them all down. The previous day was even possibly more spectacular shoot down at Bryansk. This is known as the Bryansk Patriot ambush. Now we don't know where the Patriot battery was. It's possibly here. Patriot battery's got a 160 kilometre range. That's Ukraine, that's Russia. And this Patriot battery shot down 2 M18 helicopters, electronic warfare variant, which is supposed to stop things attacking them, Su-35 and Su-34. Presumably these 2 electronic warfare helicopters were helping these 2 ingress into Ukrainian territory. And the Patriot battery was able to shoot them all down. The White House went apeshit and complained bitterly to the Ukrainians, so they didn't do it again. The 11 crew died, and being the modern age, these are photos of 8 of the 11 crew. They're all very young, because when it was obvious the Russians were running out of troops, they pulled everybody out of the academies, gave them commissions and sent them to the front line. These are Ukraine's longer range drones. Oh no, the missiles, sorry. So that dates from the Soviet era. This is the one that they developed domestically, and that sank the Moskva cruiser a couple of years ago. That's the M31 missile that the HIMARS fires. That's the Scalp Storm Shadow that the UK and France supply to Ukraine. That US ATACMS, very useful, especially with a cluster warhead at attacking airfields. And we'll go on quickly to some of the low-cost things. So Ukraine's been able to build drones out of plastic agricultural pipe. So that's 30mm or something agricultural pipe, aluminium spars up the middle, plywood cut out, cover it with plastic. These 3 are the same to reduce costs of making it. They simply tape on the warhead and off it goes. That's one crashed. These also make their own low-cost decoy drones. This is an electrically driven drone, carries a corner reflector internally, and these things are structured so that any radar beam impinging on it will be sent back at right angles to where it came from. So this makes the thing look a lot larger to the radar that's interrogating it. This is a US penetration aid of a drone. When they started making these in the mid-90s, they cost 30,000 US. They're now 300,000 US. They're a bit more capable. And this thing will travel along at Mach 0.8, and the enemy radar will either appear as an F-16 or F-15 or wherever you want it to appear to be. And the idea is the enemy will waste a $2 or $3 million missile trying to intercept it. This is an Iranian drone called the Shahed, which was famous in the first couple of years of the war. The Iranians sold the Russians a lot at an extortionate markup, but it looks like it's a copy of the Israeli Harop missile, which is a loitering munition. It's actually ill-suited for long-range stuff with that wing shape. It's too draggy, and that was its warhead. What was interesting about it, it combined explosively formed projectiles, that's these copper, so when it explodes, those form jets of copper in all directions, penetrating everything, with fragmentation at both ends. This is what the front line looks like in the air war now. The Ukrainians have to remain low. The Russians up here with the MiG-31 at 50 to 1,000 feet, firing deep into Ukrainian territory. Just as an indication that most missiles miss, actually. Back in the Serbian war, in which Bill Clinton started because Hillary told him that she wouldn't speak to him again unless he started a war with Serbia. The Serbians fired 850 SAMs at NATO aircraft. They only had a 0.36% success rate. NATO fired 743 homing anti-radiation missiles against Serbian radars, and they only had a 0.8% success rate. Things have improved a little bit then, but most missiles actually miss still. The Ukrainians have had a few years, and they've now developed some cost-effective ways of delivering high explosive on the battlefield. And this is one of the better ones. This is called the Dart, which got a micro turbojet at the back. These front canards are the only control surfaces on the aircraft. There's a very cheap empennage, and to save further money, they put it on a dolly. So it takes off on the dolly, you recover it from the end of the runway after it's taken off. It reminds me of the Jindovic drone of the RAAF of the 1960s. These are Ukrainian long-range track drones. That's the Dart where we just looked at. These are some of the other things they've made, including the thing called a Beaver. These things have flown 2,000 kilometres into Russian territory and attacked Russian naval vessels at the northern end of the Caspian Sea, and refineries 2,000 kilometres into Russia. That's a close-up of one of them. Quite cost-effective. I'm not a fan of the layout of the wings and everything, but it's 40,000 US, 30 kilo warhead, 800 kilometre range. Cost effectiveness costs you $1 US 67 to get 1 kilo, 1 kilometre. And this is the latest iteration of the homing anti-radiation missile from the Yanks, the stand-in attack weapon, because a lot of harms are actually being shot down by the Russians in Ukraine. This thing has got chines here. They're not horizontal. Those sort of chines reduce your radar signature by 90%. And there's an angle towards the ground about 30 degrees where the radar would be interrogating it. Also, it's the curse of the F-35 bomb bay. This is 4 metres long. On to the battle at sea in Ukraine. And this is quite inspiring for Australia in that a country with no navy is able to drive away one of the bigger navies on the planet, the Russian Navy, from the western end of the Black Sea to the eastern end. In fact, Novorossiysk, where the Russian Navy decamped to from Crimea, recently got abandoned by the Russians, and the Russian vessels went further east into the Black Sea due to this sort of thing. Now, I will say, if the Ukrainians can do that and drive the Russians 900 kilometres away, there's no reason why we can't repeat that and drive the Chinese 900 kilometres away from any coast we would care to drive them away from once we make the effort to do so. This is a Ukrainian marine drone, and one of the reasons why the Ukraine has so successful at marine drones and aerial drones is there are 3 separate services making their own versions of marine drones. Ukrainian intelligence, Ukrainian Navy, and some other mob make their own marine drones. They're not actually told to just have the same thing. So one of them, maybe the Navy, decided to add air-to-air missiles to a marine drone. This is an infrared 77, I think. And on the 26th of December, one of these, or perhaps a little swarm of them, shot down 2 M18 helicopters and damaged a third, which then had to fly back to land. You've got marine drones shooting down helicopters, and on the video feed they actually showed an Su-27 that these drones were following. That's the Ukraine's marine drones to date, and they've got fuses on the bow, and that's the one with the missiles. And they've also got militarised jet skis, which we see here. This was a Ukrainian jet ski washed up on a beach in Turkey. Starlink camera, and these 2 barrel-like things on either side. They look like shaped charges at the proper standoff distance. The shaped charge should be 8 times the diameter of the shaped charge itself from what you want to hit, and that gives space for the molten stream of copper to form and hit the side of the whatever you want to hit, in this case a ship. But also I'd have made it actually face down so you hit it underwater rather than above the waterline. The next thing you ask is how many jet skis are there in Australia that we can turn into drones and send out against the Chinese? And there's 90,000 jet skis. And I've told all my friends with jet skis, when the war starts, your jet skis are going to be commandeered for the greater good. There's another thing that's quite profound. This is profound as the Royal Navy attack on Taranto in 41, where ferry swordfish dropped torpedoes at the Italian fleet in anchor at Taranto. The Ukrainians got one of their marine drones, and they equipped it to launch FPV drones. And that took out, one night, they took out 3 Russian SAM systems, which wouldn't be expecting to be attacked. But it also means anybody with a Chinese ship turning up in harbour, suddenly one of the containers could pop open and a whole lot of drones could come out and they could attack things 200 kilometres away. It's quite profound, and that's an impression of what it looks like. That's the fuses to set up in case it wants to run into something and blow it up, and these are the FPV drones coming out of the hold. On the subject of marine drones, the US recently made up this drone, the Sea Hunter, 40 metres long, weighs 145 tonnes. Looks like it's set up to have very low drag. One of these recently crossed the Pacific and ended up in Sydney Harbour. And the Chinese made a copy of it, which is 3 times larger. This is just to say that in the defence, you have 1/3 to 1/5 or more lower of the losses of the attacking force in the age of drones and so on. So Andrew, Perpetua again. This is normally upright on the screen. I've tilted it sideways to show Russian losses relative to Ukrainian losses for the same type of thing. Tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, armoured personnel carriers, trucks, civilians. This is on the 13th of April 2024. Let's go into what Russian losses by type have been since the war started. And this is 2022 to 2024. This is Russian artillery losses. Started off low, started rising, peaked simply because they were starting to run out of our barrels. And this is Russian tank losses by month, same period. They've almost lost 10,000 tanks so far. The personnel, they're up to beyond 800,000. Probably a third are killed, the rest are wounded. Helicopter losses, you notice they started high and then died off, simply because either they've run out of helicopters or helicopters are too easy to shoot down. I think that Bryansk's Patriot ambush shows that you could be 100 kilometres behind the front and the enemy can shoot you down with ground-launched missiles. Armoured fighting vehicle losses by month. They've now lost 20,000. Throw in the tanks and they've lost 30,000 bits of armoured equipment. Most of the patrimony that they inherited from the Soviet period. And this is Russian personnel losses by month. Steady rise from the start of the war. They're now losing about 50,000 a month, sometimes beyond 2,000 a day. And you expect about 1/3 to be killed. And this rising trend suggests a Lanchester collapse. And this is it by year, plotted on top of each other. That's 2022, when the war started. monthly rise, another rise. What I find interesting about these last 2 months of every year is that's 68% greater than that level, and that's 68% greater than that level. So as a rate of loss continues to rise, that should be losing 2,600 people a day. Now that's an important number because right at the moment, thanks to the last Strategic Defence Review, Australia is only protected by one combined arms brigade, which is normally 3,000 people. A modern war will chew through Australia's whole armoured force in one day's losses. There are plenty of lessons from the Ukraine war. We're now 1.5 hours in, and you can read this from the PDF. But the big lessons are you don't need a navy to sink a navy, which is fine for us because we don't really have a navy. You don't need an air force to stop enemy air overflight because all you need is a decent surface-to-air missile system. We don't have those either, by the way, but artillery is still king of the battlefield. And active protection systems. This whole business of drones reminds me of Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 2006 when they took on Hezbollah. And the Israelis were quite surprised because Hezbollah started using Cornet anti-tank guided missiles, a tandem charge explosively formed projectile. And suddenly the Israelis were having a high rate of losses of their Merkava tanks from flank attacks. So the Israelis decided to build active protection systems for the tanks, and they made two. One's called Trophy from Elbit, and it has 4 radars in the corner of the turret and 4 little banks of projectile launchers. So the radar will detect the anti-tank guided missile coming in at 200 metres a second, and about 3 to 5 metres out, it'll like a shotgun cartridge going off, but except on a larger scale. And this molten copper will then hit out and destroy the incoming anti-tank guided missile. And it's been quite successful. Very few Israeli tank losses in this last blow-up in Gaza and southern Lebanon. And the Israelis have been happily running around and shown videos of incoming anti-tank guided missiles and the tanks taking them out just short of the tank. Now, obviously, you could simply tweak the software, and if something's coming in and be defeated at 200 metres a second, something coming in at 20 metres a second could be far easily defeated, especially if it's only plastic and the rest. Now, with that there's nobody on either side of the Ukraine war has been using active protection systems on their tanks or infantry fighting vehicles or anything else. So we haven't been able to see it as yet. But it does add about $1 million US to the cost of every vehicle. One lesson from the Ukraine war is that the Western countries are now run by completely deranged people. So you may not remember this, but early on, John Kerry, who could have been President of the United States, said that people will feel better about the invasion of Ukraine if the Russians didn't emit so much carbon dioxide. Now, the moral story for us is that we're not using coal, we're putting in windmills and the rest of it. We're sending coal off to China. China's using that stuff to make stuff, using that coal to make stuff to kill us. The analogy, historic analogy, is Bob Menzies, beginning of World War II. He was known as Pig Iron Bob because he sent Australian pig iron to Japan, who at that stage had several years of invading and killing Chinese. But his bigger crime was he chose the wrong fighter aircraft for Australia. He was a bit of a royalty freak and empire lover, and we should have been buying the American ones at the time. But we can do better than that. The Albanese government decided to remove to the National Security Committee of Cabinet the head of ASIO and the head of whatever it is, security thing, and replaced him from the Climate Change Department Secretary to attend the National Security Committee of Cabinet while removing the top intelligence chiefs. We're absolutely idiotic, but it gets worse. I'll just keep saying it gets worse. This is from a photograph, whatever the newspaper in Darwin's called, and this is an army captain who about 2 years ago now applied to his superiors. He wanted to wear a dress to work, the female uniform to work. Bear in mind, a captain runs a company of about 120 people, and all those people are supposed to put their trust in him to keep them alive on the battlefield. No question you ask yourself. Now, bear in mind, he must have known they were going to give him the okay to do this, and he proceeded. But the question you ask yourself is, does this mean that he thinks he's a man trapped in a woman's body, which is bad because that's called gender dysphoria. It's the worst mental illness to have, with a 50% suicide rate. Or is it something not as bad? Well, I looked up the psychological manuals, and it could be transvestic fetishism, where he gets it off by wearing the other sex's clothing. No, it's bad. There's some things that have happened in the last couple of years which suggest our high command has no grip on reality, doesn't know what it's like on the ground, actually loathes the troops under their command. It's the Brereton Report. Brereton Report, 432 pages. I read the whole thing the day it came out. On page 120 is this paragraph, which is worth reading out because it says, clearance operations. Dr. Krompovitz was told that after squirters were dealt with, special forces were then cordoned off a village, taking men and boys to guest houses, which are typically located on the edge of the village. There they were tied up and tortured by special forces, sometimes for days. When the special forces left, men and boys were found dead, shot in the head or blindfolded with throats slit. Now it sounds horrific, but no village like that was found. None has ever been named. When Krompovitz was hired by the head of the bloke who ran the army to write a report on atrocities committed by special forces, the old army lags, if you ever hang out with them, they can be quite entertaining. They knew what Krompovitz wanted, so they gave it to her, which is tales of horror. Anyway, it gets repeated as fact in a report. Everybody in our high command believed it. The Prime Minister at the time rang up the Afghan President and apologised for what Australian Special Forces did. It was just a make-up. And the people who ran the place have got no idea that this is nonsense. They believed it. Otherwise it would have been pulled out of the report. Oh yes, this bloke, who's a legal Major General in the Army, but he's got a legal career in the civilian life, in the reserves, he didn't get the stories he wanted until he started paying the Afghans to tell them. And he says that in the report. He was told you've got an unlimited budget and unlimited time to put your report together. He went to Afghanistan, no one would tell him the stories he wanted until he started paying them. And that's Dr. Krompovitz herself. Thanks to a short period of Dutton being Defence Minister, we know that she was paid $6 million over a period of a couple of years to write this sort of stuff. So it's a very lucrative little literary niche. Our High Command's need for stories just about how beastly Australian Special Forces are. They can tell these stories to each other, before bedtime. Here's another story that came out of Krompovitz, which says, the inquiry was found that it was credible information that junior soldiers were required by the patrol commanders to shoot a prisoner in order to achieve the soldier's first kill, and then they would plant a gun on him and then make it up for the records. No single incident of this has been recorded in any government report. You expect several thousand Australians got rotated from Afghanistan. You expect several hundred of these to have been blooded, so to speak, by shooting an unarmed prisoner, but no single incident was able to be named. Another sign that our High Command is mentally unwell. They don't actually like things that go bang. We've recently built this thing, Arafura class offshore patrol vessel, weighs 1,600 tonnes, crew of 40. Its only armament is a 25mm gun here on the bow, which could probably shoot about 2 kilometres. Any vessel coming over the horizon, with or without radar, could see this 20 kilometres away and sink it within a couple of minutes. The Army, we're now in the process of buying 129 of these, weigh 42 tonnes, 1/40th the size of that, 10th of the size of the crew, and it's got a bigger gun. The people running the Army and the whole Defence Force, they don't really like killing people or the idea of it. They're much rather running drag queen story hour at a petting zoo. They're more suited to that. In terms of how deranged they are, the RAAF doesn't miss out. We had 24 F-111s at the start, but a couple of years ago they didn't like them anymore, so they decided to pull the wings off like schoolboys torturing flies and bury them in a pit near Ipswich. They could have put them in museums. They made a cock and bull story about the fact they had secret technology in them and they couldn't pull the technology out, so they had to bury them instead. The Army's done one better. The story of the Taipan helicopters, a utility helicopter from Airbus, back in 2004, The Army wanted new utility and attack helicopters. So Howard was the Prime Minister at the time. The Army wanted Apaches and Black Hawks, and Howard opted for Airbus because Airbus promised $1 billion of offsets, which we never saw. The Army didn't like running the Taipans. They had a few problems with them. Eventually they talked the government into getting rid of them and getting Apaches and Black Hawks like they wanted 20 years ago. But the Army decided these things were worth $20 million each, second hand. They had another $450 million worth of spares. So 900 mil for the helicopters, all we could have given to Ukraine, which wanted them and asked for them. But no, they pulled the rotors off and buried them all in a pit. That's $1,300 million. Everybody from the head of Army Aviation up to the Prime Minister is complicit in this waste of $1.3 billion, and they couldn't care less. If you wanted to build a shed to put them in, I did the sums, it would have been $26 million to have a shed big enough to take them all while you found a better use for them. Now, this is a photo of those Taipans sitting in a shed in Townsville prior to internment with their rotors pulled off. So that begs the question, what do Hitler, Genghis Khan and these 43 helicopters have in common? They're all buried in an unmarked grave. Now another sign of the mental illness. South Korea lives in it's a country located in a difficult neighbourhood. Everyone who wants to kill them, everybody around them has got nuclear weapons, and make threats and everything all the time. So they've gone gangbusters, making their own family of ballistic missiles, doing up to this size, great ranges and everything. They're also building their own nuclear bombs at the moment. What do? Our High Command is upset whatever our dogs might be thinking. Special for dog handlers been ordered to face retraining for cultural sensitivity. And it gets worse. There was a former army chief, not this bloke, that's Angus Campbell, who's got his own problems, had a predilection for wearing women's shoes in public. In retirement, he took $200 a year from Deloitte to advise on diversity. And we'll see why he would have done that in a little while. Angus Campbell, this bloke, wanted to strip all the medals off the Afghan veterans, all 3,000 or 4,000 of them, but keep his own Distinguished Service Cross for being 900 kilometres away in Dubai, where he ran the operation for 1 year. And the deep state looks after its own, because Penny Wong gave this bloke's wife in retirement a job of ambassador for gender equality, so the family gets a few $100,000 extra each year so she can run around and stay in foreign hotels. And this is delusionment again. Take joint action on climate. If worshipping the weather gods is your thing, that's one thing. But it's absolutely delusional to think you can incorporate that into practice. Another sign that we've gone third world. It took a question from a Green senator to winkle this data out of the freak show. But this is the number of other ranks compared to brigadiers and above. Other ranks per brigadier. In Australia we've got 260 other ranks. Proper armies, there's UK 1,200, and the US 1,500 other ranks per brigadier. We only need 44. We've probably got 5 times as many higher ranks. So this is what happens with some of those countries that have more admirals than they actually have ships at sea. We're already there. Why Deloitte would have given Morrison $200,000 a year? Because these are the numbers of consultants employed full-time in ADF headquarters in Russell Hill. There's 2 battalions worth, 1,900 of them. They'd be each costing $500,000 each to run. That's $1 billion a year. We could stand up another battalion, a whole brigade with this. More derangement. The current head of the army was promoted in that position because he's considered to be intellectual. He's considered to be intellectual because he ripped the diesel engine out of a Bushmaster and replaced it with batteries. And they thought, this is the future, we're all going electric. They're thinking now of charging this thing by towing a generator around behind it. Can it get worse? Well, I was told on the way in here that we actually don't have any submarine commanders anymore. We've got 6 submarines, only 1 can go to sea, because we've got a bloke from the Canadian Navy that's come over to run that submarine. But nobody likes to work in this sort of freak show. So all the good people leave first, and it means they're not meeting their recruiting targets. So late last year, the ADF decided, well, we'll relax a few standards. relaxing health entry requirements, mental challenges, and international citizens, which is another word for mercenaries. So we can have this pudgy, mentally unstable mercenaries, which is very bad for unit cohesion. You've got to be able to trust the bloke standing beside you in the trench. And there's some Machiavellian mercenaries, if you want to be classical about it. Is there a solution to this problem that we have? Well, there's a promising analogy from Australian military history. Back on the 13th of August 1940, this bomber, an RAAF Hudson, took off from Melbourne, crashed on the way into Canberra. Everybody on board died, including the Chief of the General Staff, 2 Ministers of the Crown, other notables. Now, when Australia went into the Second World War, our conduct of the war was quite poor, noticeably poor. When all these people died and got replaced, conduct of the war noticeably improved. It's just a couple of 737s worth. We'll get rid of all the people we need to get rid of, and we'll promote some people who actually have an interest in defending the country. But there is a bit of quality in the dross. What this is a track of an RAAF wedgetail over Poland. This is Ukraine, that's Kiev, Lvov, and it's running backwards and forward here after midnight, tracking Russian cruise missiles entering the Ukrainian Air Force and telling the Ukrainians what's coming. Quite a useful humanitarian service. And what the interesting thing about the wedgetail, it sees in the L band, which means it should be seeing stealth. It's not strong enough of to get an actual missile fix, but you can know what's coming and where it is in broad terms. So before we go in to discuss the problems of Australian force structure, we've got, in the Navy, we've got an old small surface fleet, but doesn't matter because it's going to be irrelevant. Submarines are good, and the nuclear ones will be good when they turn up. We've got no way of plucking people from the open ocean. In the Second World War, we had Catalinas, so if a ship sank or a plane got shot down, you could send a Catalina to pick them up. The war coming, people will be out on the open ocean for weeks at a time until they die of thirst. It's quite an idiotic situation. The Army, every review of Defence Forces is an excuse to cut the size of the actual fighting force. And as I said, the Defence Strategic Review cut it from 3 combined arms brigades down to 1. So when you now have 3,000 troops defending a nation of 27 million people, everybody else is supporting. We're getting some missiles, but at the mercy of Raytheon and Lockheed for the in Australia build. They'll probably just send a few parts over. We do final assembly, but we'll learn nothing from the process. We've got no mines, no drones. We're run by actual perverts. In the Air Force, we've only got light bombers. The F-35 and the Super Hornet are only light bombers, as I'll show you. Coming on, no proper fighter aircraft. Indonesia has been far more intelligent about what they've been buying, and they could shoot down the RAAF 3 times over with what they get. We also need a force that can deliver anti-ship ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. In the US Air Force, the F-35, the mainstay of our Air Force and the Air Force, the nickname the pilots have given it is Fat Amy, which sums up all you need to know about it. It's a fat, useless, wallowing thing. Indonesians bought 42 Rafales and 24 F-15EX by comparison. What we can do is buy the parked up Gripen C and Ds and build a Gripen E under licence. This series of slides will show you how to build an Air Force cost effectively. If you had $1 billion US, what could you buy with it? And these aircraft, at their sale price, you could buy these many Gripens, these many F-22s when they were still building. The latest price was US $205 million a copy. The latest fighter iteration for the US Air Force is NGAD, Next Generation Air Dominance. It's going to cost more than $300 million per aircraft, and the US Air Force is balking at that. But they know they can't stick around with the F-35. Now, Gripen, Rafale, Typhoon and F-22, they're all basically equally capable. And a late entrant is the F-15EX with an electronic warfare suite, which costs about $15 million per plane, but stealth may be as good as the F-22. What it does is take the impinging radar signals from whatever's lighting up the F-15 and sends back a slightly delayed signal or a counter signal, and it makes the F-15 disappear from the enemy radar. The US pilots flying it are quite excited about it. Then you get the daily sorties per $1 billion. because the F-35 and the F-22 can only get into the air every second day. They've got very low availability. In fact, there's a GAO report from a couple of months ago that said F-22 units have 24 aircraft in them, and that's so they can get 12 aircraft into the air any one day. Then you get the loss exchange rate against enemy aircraft. So this shows the Gripen F-22, Super Hornet, the F-35 against the Su-35. And the Gripen and the F-22 shoot down the Su-35 faster than the Su-35 shoots down those aircraft. The Su-35 shoots down the F-35 and the F-35 and the Super Hornet at a greater rate. If you calculate this out, the Gripen can shoot down the Super Hornet 20 to 1. That's the loss exchange rate. You get those three things, calculate them out. $1 spent on the Gripen is 21 times more valuable than $1 spent on the F-35. Now, it's not just me saying this. There's an esteemed aviation journalist called Bill Sweetman, who spent decades as an aviation journalist, mostly for Aviation Week. Then Lockheed made sure he was fired. He ended up in Northrop, and more recently he retired. In retirement, he wrote this book, The $1 Trillion Train Wreck, on the F-35. He's not a fan, but be aware it's only 80 pages. Back to Lanchester Squares. Now, this is a very powerful technique of analysis of how armies clash, armed forces clash, and Frederick Lanchester came out with this book in 1916 during the First World War. You can calculate the outcome of battles, and it basically says the square of the numerical strength multiplied by the relative fighting value. So we know that the Gripen's 0.8 of an F-22 multiplied by that. If you had 100 F-22s, you only need 112 Gripen E's to counter that. And the difference in cost is you're paying $20 billion for those US, for those F-22s. You're paying less than half that for the Gripen E. The hourly operating cost in the F-22 is now $85,000 an hour US, and it's about $7,000 US on the Gripen E. So the annual operating cost is 1/10 less for this Air Force compared to that Air Force. And this lesson seems to be lost on everybody running Western Air Forces these days. Other problems with F-35 can only take off from airfields that are 8,000 foot long. And in fact, Williamstown, where the F-35 pilots are trained for the RAAF, had to be lengthened from 8,000 feet to 10,000 feet to take on that training role. How many 10,000 foot runways are there in Australia, or even 8,000 foot? There's only 25, only 5 in Northern Australia where the threat is. And worse than that, in that the F-35 requires specialist power supply, a 600 volt power supply, and specialist air conditioning. It has to sit overnight in air conditioning. If you leave it out in the runway in the middle of summer, it might heat up. It uses its fuel as a coolant. And the RAAF found, years after the US Air Force found, that an F-35 left out on the tarmac might refuse to start if it's too hot. In which case, if they do that in the middle of the Australian monsoon season and it stays 40 degrees centigrade overnight, you might have to pack it with dry ice or something to get it to work again. This is a sign that the bomb bay runs too hot. So because the thing's packed tighter than a head of cabbage in terms of the innards, it's very costly to build, very costly to repair. You've got to pull a lot of things out to get to something that's failed internally. But the bomb bay runs at 100 degrees centigrade. Normally, under 20,000 feet, the F-35's got to open its bomb bay every 20 minutes to let the heat out. At 100 degrees centigrade, you do get some degradation of electronics, of missiles and things you're carrying internally. And as a sign of this, for that Kongsberg missile I was talking about earlier, up here under avionics, it says special equipment for F-35 internal bay conditions, which means the bomb bay. You can cook meals inside the bomb bay of the F-35. It's also packed with fuel. Every nook and cranny has got a little fuel tank inside it, which means the thing will catch fire as soon as it's hit. And more on it, Fat Amy, you can read that online. Also on refueling. Because of those 11 fuel tanks, and when it's refueling in mid-air, the computer figures out where to pump the fuel to keep the centre of balance at the same place. Otherwise it might tip out. So that means it takes 7 minutes to refuel instead of a couple of minutes for an ordinary aircraft. And US Air Force pilots say if you're refueling a flight of 4, send number 4 home straight away, because you won't get to him. This is availability rates. This is just to remind people that it's not like cars these days compared to when we're growing up. Your car may or may not start in the morning, it might have some problem. They always start these days. But even in the French Air Force, with their own made Rafales, they only get about a 50% availability rate on any day of the week. Not much better in the Royal Air Force. Operating costs go up with time. 10 years ago, when I started looking at fighter aircraft and everything, the B-1B was a bargain. It could carry 16.8 tonnes of bombs and had an operating cost of US $60,000 an hour. 10 years later, the operating cost is threefold, up to 180,000 US an hour. It suddenly went past 30 years and suddenly things start failing. So the Yanks were trying to flog them off to the Indians recently, actually. There's this operating cost by aircraft. You can see the F-22 up here. Most of the rest around the 30 to 40,000 mark. The Gripen would come in under here. This is their bomber operating cost per hour. The B-2's up at 200,000 US an hour. B-1B, it's sort of flying off the sunset due to age, starting around 10 years ago. B-52 has now been flying for 60 years odd. It's going to have a 100-year life. After flying it for 60 years, they finally decide to re-engine it, and that'll double its range to 12,000 nautical miles. Now, there are some good people in the United States, in the military, and also in Congress, and there's a Congressional Budget Office and the Congressional Research Service have been trying to warn us. So this is a graph of F-35 availability by type. The F-35A, which the Air Force flies, which our Air Force flies, the C for the US Navy, and the B for the Marine Corps, and they've got availabilities down to 10 to 20%. And the reason why they're putting this graph into their report is also to warn us. So that's availability rates for Air Force fighters by age. F-15E, now 30 years old. The F-22, 15 years old, and F-35. At 5 years out the door, the availability rate is down to 40%. It's in a death dive. It'll probably end up being a hangar queen, but it means we need real fighter aircraft soon. Also, the supply situation for logistics. We're supposed to get supplied out of the continental US. None of the operating air force is supposed to keep their own stock of parts. And when a war comes, and we can only get things flown into the country, we'll be at the end of the supply effort. This is the US Air Force by age, by aircraft type, and by making a number of bad decisions over decades, they have now got a very old Air Force. Basically, the average age of the fighter aircraft is older than most of their pilots on age. That's a B-52 out here, now 60. The bulk of their Air Force is still these F-16s, now 30 years old, because that's 2021 year data. This is the original sin of the F-35. To sell it to the Marine Corps, you had to take off and land vertically. To do that, you have to support the whole weight of a 13-ton aircraft on a pillar of fire. This is an infrared photograph at night, and that's the afterburner, full afterburner. They've also got a fan here, and that thing can take off and land vertically. But that meant a number of things. The thing is wider, the engine runs hotter. But first of all, the father of the F-35 is the Yak 141, because the Soviet Navy was the first people to have a supersonic fighter that could take off and land vertically. The granddad is the Yak 38, a bit like the Harrier. Oh, this thing flew at Farnborough in 1992 under a deal they did with Lockheed, where they handed over the data to Lockheed, and the F-35 flew in 2016. Now, one big problem that's come out of the F-35 that I wasn't aware of last decade is to get the maximum out of the engine, they made it run hotter. The F-35 engine is derived from the engine for the F-22. An F-22 engine runs at 1649 centigrade in the after section of the turbines. F-35 is 333 degrees hotter. It's well above the melting point of the turbine blades, which is around 1400 centigrade. And the turbine blades are stopped from melting by having air force through them. So it's a very complicated process. And the Chinese have yet to be able to master making high performance jet engines. The funny thing is, a couple of years ago, we started seeing headlines like this, that the F-22 may not be able to afford new F-35 engines, may need new engines as soon as 2027. New engine makes no sense. Plenty of headlines saying we need a new engine, but no one told us why. And the reason is because if you're running that much hotter, you get dust in the atmosphere, and that sticks to turbine blades in this part of the motor and forms a subject like bricks, and therefore the engine has to be taken offline. So at one stage, a couple of years ago, 10% of F-35s were out of service simply because they lacked an engine. And how they got the amount of lift needed to take the thing off vertically? They upped their bypass ratio. So there's a proper fighter aircraft, usually around the 30% bypass ratio. They doubled it for the F-35, which means the engine's wider and draggier most of the time. So for a few moments of the flight regime of 7% of the F-35 force, the whole fleet was hobbled with an engine which consumes fuel 18% higher rate than other fighter aircraft. This is how it plots up in engine weight in kilos versus wet thrust, that is afterburner. They plot up in a straight line, except for the F-35 is up here. Comes at a cost. Now, Lockheed and the F-35 project office must have told their Air Force a number of porkies, because they said it's going to cost $25,000 US an hour to run the F-35. Pilots need 20 hours of training a month to remain proficient. Any less than that, the accident rate goes up and they don't know how to use their weapons and everything. We only have a certain budget for pilot training. So then they found that the actual operating cost is $45,000 US an hour instead of 25. They simply cut the flying hours down to 13, which means we're sending a little light bomber into combat with pilots that aren't even properly trained to fly it. A fun fact about the F-35, a problem with the US Defence Forces in recent years, they don't bother investing in spares. So for a good part of the last few years, 25% of F-35s have been out of action simply because they lack spares on site. And how you get stealthy, if you've got a non-stealthy shape, you spackle it up with resin full of tiny little iron balls. An indication of that, this is F-35Cs, the US Navy variant on the USS Carl Vinson. They've all turned rusty because the stealth coating is rusting in the salt spray. And the F-35 isn't actually all that stealthy. Stealth isn't on and off, it's not a switch. This is the radar spectrum, and this is the F-35. It's only got full stealth from a little narrow cone around the front. As a reminder that most missiles miss, this is a couple of years ago now, but this is a retired Air Force Phantom turned into an aerial drone. An F-35 fired 2 radar-guided missiles at it and both missed under the most benign circumstances possible. How they sold it to us? Well, they got a contraption of aluminium and titanium and plastic and copper. They put the F designation in it saying it's a fighter, and they sell it for about $10,000 a kilo. Whatever copper is these days, $5 a kilo, you get a big markup. If you put an F designation, they've done it before, and the Super Hornet was actually designed to carry 4 2,000-pound bombs. This thing was designed to carry 2 2,000-pound bombs internally. The F-111 was actually a good aircraft, but it was never a fighter, and that thing carried 2,000 bombs internally also. US defence acquisition in aircraft has been broken for 2 generations now. It's going to be going on for 50 years. So what this graph shows is the number of years from starting the design process to getting the thing on the street for cars, commercial aircraft, and US military aircraft. And since 1975, every year that's passed, and adds another 6 months to the amount of time taken to get an aircraft into the air. Indonesia, it's worth doing it in detail because they've been far more intelligent about all their military purchases compared to Australia. 42 Rafales, probably one of the best aircraft on the planet. They're buying 24 F-15EX, which are basically a stealthy bomb truck and missile truck. As well as that, they've got 33 F-16s, 5 Su-27s, 11 Su-30s. They're not phased by having a variety of fighter aircraft types. And this thing has now got a 10-year backlog on the production line, so we can't buy them if we wanted to. A number of countries set out to make their own stealth fighters. It's not all that difficult because South Korea's got a GDP much the same as Australia's. They made their own stealth aircraft. They all make copies of the F-22. In fact, in South Korea, this thing is nicknamed the Baby Raptor. They should have copied the YF-23, which lost out to the F-22 back in 1991. The Ghost Bat, we were right proud of ourselves when it was announced for the first time for 50 years, we're making military aircraft in Australia. This thing could fly around as a collaborative aircraft to the F-35 and do stuff with it. Turns out it's unarmed. I wondered where they're going to fit everything on it because the shape's the wrong shape. It narrows the bottom, so you can't carry it stealthy. You can't have a big Bombay there because there's no room for it. There's only enough room for the wheels. And apparently the US DoD says, no, you can't arm the Ghost Bat, even if it has hard points on its wings. Now, Boeing said, when this thing started out a few years ago, the thing's made with wings for a bit of turning, reasonably large control surfaces, so this could fly around with a fighter aircraft to keep up with it. But our Air Force probably hobbled it with a little motor, which means it can only fly straight and level, but it's absolutely useless. If you want to make a proper drone, there's an example of one. Long, narrow wings, high amount of lift compared to the drag that they cause, slanted tails. Doesn't need this inlet here, which could be a big radar reflector. That's probably the best shape if you want to escape radar. And this is a better shape in terms of a trade-off between utility and lack of radar reflections. This is the M25 Stingray, used by the US Navy. It's got a chine here which will cut the radar reflections by 90%. Long, narrow wings with low drag. There's no visible inlet because it's flush with the upper surface. That's the air inlet here. And that's it over in the US, pictured with a Ghost Bat. They tell us the size of this. The RAAF won't tell us the size of this motor or what it is. Now, but the Ghost Bat has been useful because we built something for the first time for a long time. And what would it cost to make things in the modern day? Because we need to do so to be able to protect ourselves. These days, it's commonly accepted you spend 4,000 US for a pound of an aircraft, a fighter aircraft. And there's a company called Kratos in the US who made this thing, the Valkyrie. It says we've got it down to 600 US a pound, and they have done. So that thing's only cost 1.5 million US. A Honda jet, which is a small private jet, will build a course, 847 US dollars retail per pound. A Toyota Camry, 30,000 pounds, costs 3,000 pounds, $30,000. Retail, including dealer markup and everything, is only 10 US dollars a pound. If you can get the scale of operations, you can get the unit cost down to something reasonable. Now, just east of here, in the suburb of Malaga, there's a company called Arbitec who makes a hand tool that weighs 9.5 pounds. Equivalent US price is $792 retail. That's $83 a pound. But their operating cost of actually making this is only 19 US a pound. These is what, then this is quite a precision thing. It's got a tough environment. It basically cuts brickwork and concrete and the rest of it and survives. This is what our manufacturing cost should be on all missiles and tanks and everything else. And this is part of the task the war will start with. This is AIS return of all the ships at sea. Everything over 500 tonnes is required to have a transponder which has the name of the vessel, its direction, the port it's going to, and what type of vessel it is. And that's why they're different colours, running in different directions. That's Diego Garcia, which the UK government wants to hand over to Mauritius for no good reason. Cocos Islands. And because of the Houthis, most of the traffic is now coming around the Cape of Good Hope. Now we know where all these things are, and we have to attack the Chinese ones. And drones would be very useful as a missile truck accompanying a P-8 Poseidon or a Wedgetail or the like. We want to attack them. We want to attack the Chinese with ballistic missiles, anti-ship ballistic missiles. Now that was pioneered in recent years by the Russians who got their Iskander, strapped it onto a MiG-31, called it the Kinzhal, which means dagger in Russian, and it doubled the range from 500 kilometres to beyond 1,000 kilometres. The Chinese decided to copy them. And this is a Chinese ballistic missile attached to a H-6 bomber. H-6 bombers derived from the Tu-16, which first flew in Russia in 1952. So this is a 70-year-old design. You can see it on radar from a great distance. And then late last year, on the 26th of December, internet images arrived of this thing the Russians had built. Now previously I'd been very dismissive of Chinese fighter aircraft design, because it looked like the things drawn by schoolboys. Wrong sort of shape, too draggy. But this thing, for its mission, which is to launch ballistic missiles against US carriers, is just about perfect. It's very large, it's got 3 engines, and that's a J-20, Chinese supersonic fighter, and that's this new one. And it's got a third engine, 3 engines, but one's in the middle with a dorsal intake just behind the pilot here. And that's from behind. And from the Chinese internet, how it compares to the J-20, little bomb bay with air-to-air missiles, but this bomb bay's 8 metres long and carry probably a couple of ballistic missiles with an optimal range of about 2 kilometres themselves. So if this thing can fly 2,000 kilometres supersonically, launch these 2 ballistic missiles, they'll be able to hit ships at sea beyond Guam. That's a bit too complicated for this stage of the afternoon. Australian Army, tanks aren't dead. We're shrinking it down to something that's far too small. There's a lot of things we should do, but I'll get into now the story of the Redback. Back in the 1960s, when we were a nation of 12 million people, we bought 813 Redback infantry fighting vehicles, or armoured personnel carriers, weigh 13 tonnes, can't withstand anything larger than a 50 calibre, but never mind. And then this is a Swedish CV-90 that came along, and it's been updated, it's quite good. These are German offerings from Rheinmetall, the Boxer. We're making 329 Boxers in Brisbane. The Redback's going to be built by Hanwha in a facility outside Melbourne. There's the Bradley of 28 tonnes, did very well in the US in Desert Storm of 91 and again in 2001. The Redback's 42 tonnes. On the Russian side, they started off the T-34 and T-62 in the 60s, T-72 in the 70s, and they've stayed around 40 tonnes thereafter. The Redback weighs as much as a Russian main battle tank, and that's why it's so survivable, because it weighs so much. But the proper main battle tanks are up here at the high 60s, 65 tonnes, and there's the K2 Black Panther. The advantage this tank has over the Abrams, we're giving Ukraine our last 49 of the first ones we received. We're getting a new version, but it's got a gas turbine engine, which means it has twice the fuel consumption of a diesel engine. The Abrams takes 20 litres of diesel to start, and in a future when we'll be very much fuel constrained, that means your logistic tail carrying carting fuel to the front is going to be twice as large as it needs to be, and that's a major weakness. What if we had 10 combined arms brigades instead of just one? That's the sort of thing we need. Also, the Army needs its own transport aircraft. The RAAF, as soon as the war starts, it says we're flat out and can't help you. These are the things we should be buying, the C-295. People are building them under licence, and the Skytruck, which had been used by US Air Force Special Operation Command, so it's quite suitable for purpose. Royal Australian Navy is too small. Let's go into the meaty stuff. The Ghost Shark, it'll be quite useful. It's unarmed, but the latest Stuart class on launch in the UK, they'd found that their hydrophones could pick up vessels on the other side of the Atlantic. US craft leaving US ports could be picked up thousands of kilometres across the Atlantic. This thing's like to be highly capable, and if you have enough of those out at sea, they can be an underwater net. You can't find them. They can triangulate on everything. And they'll provide targets for P-8 Poseidon. This is a US offering in a similar sort of concept called the Orca. Then you can add in a 10-metre long payload section. Combined with drones, these are going to be quite profound in future battles. One of the good things that Tony Abbott as Prime Minister could have done, he wanted to get Soryu class submarines to replace the Collins class. And the Japanese submarine practice is to only have 2 cycles, 2 10-year cycles. They only keep the submarines for 20 years on the notion that technological evolution will be faster than 30 years. And so a whole new class of Japanese submarines has come along called the Taigai class, and this is a Taigai submarine. Well, we should also get these to pick up people at sea. We don't have any flying boats. We're going to find a marine war without flying boats, just idiotic. Let's discuss it. But this is the schedule for the Virginia class. We'll be getting 3 out of the US. They've named them. If you read the right government report, US government report, they'll tell you the names. And then you can look up how old they are. And we'll be getting them in about 10 years. So they'll have remaining 20 years. If the POMs don't get their act together in time with Australia, do we have an option of buying another 3 Virginias beyond that? But using a 3-year delivery schedule and a 30-year life, we're building a force of 10 nuclear submarines. That's fine. They're great things. And there's also a benefit, I don't say it here, where do I say it? That because we're doing such a poor job of looking after the Collins class, we currently could put 1 at sea. A lot of the staff have left because they don't like the Navy anymore. The US Navy recently has said, get your act together on the Collins class so you're not getting Virginias. They don't want to sell us the metal. They're selling us the metal at $1.2 billion US a tonne. The steel that costs $3,000 a tonne, say. But what they want is distributed force against China to make the Chinese planning far more complicated by having another base that Virginia class operate of. Because I probably think that they're not going to get the opportunity to operate out of Fremantle unless Australian nuclear submarines are operating out of Fremantle. We get a lot more benefit out of conventional submarines if they could be refuelled on the way north, as they did in World War II. When there were 72 US submarines in Fremantle, they'd travel up to Exmouth Gulf. There was a Liberty ship there that topped them up their tanks and they got another 1,000 kilometres of range out of them. Now my part of the solution is let's fire ballistic missiles from commercial aircraft. You can buy retired 737s for about 4 million Aussie. You can buy 767s retired for about $9 million. They've got a lot of landings on the clock, but you don't have to fly them only once or twice a year. There are plenty of pilots around that can fly these things. If you could strap missiles to the wings, we're away. And we could start delivering ballistic missiles to the oncoming Chinese invasion fleet. And I'm not the first to think of this. Back in the 80s, when the US Air Force wanted to save money, they had a concept of launching cruise missiles out of 747s by rotary racks on conveyor belt to a port on the starboard side. Also, we should get these things for our Navy. Back in the beginning of 2024, they built 35 of these, Ukraine, rate US 8 million, which is US 229 each. You probably need to use 7 at a time, but you'd sink a $300 million Chinese warship. And the concept of converting civilian aircraft, the P-8 Poseidon is actually a 737. And it's adapted to be able to launch torpedoes, which is much the same as missiles. The B-21 versus the B-22. The economics of using bombers versus submarines. Bombers are far more efficient ways using standoff weapons to deliver high explosive to the enemy. And this is a couple of years ago now, but this is all the commercial aircraft parked up in Alice Springs. We could have adapted. Now, economies of Asia now recovered a bit and they've all flown off. The economics of sinking a planned destroyer, and this leads back to the cover slide. This is the Prism. This is an upgrade from Atacams, which has a 300 kilometre range. 500 kilometre range is ground launched. In May last year, they shot a couple of Increment 2 version of it, which has a maritime seeker, an infrared seeker, and that was able to hit a ship moving at sea. Air launch range would be 1,000 kilometres. We contributed to the development of Prism, and we will be making a number of them in Australia. We really need to up the production rate. I should mention the Gender Lee radar network, which is quite good, simply because of the improvement in electronics over the last 30 years. This thing can see most of the things happening. And they've structured it to have 3 stations that start their coverage just on our coastline. And they go out another further 2,000 kilometres. We really should push these out to the coast, put new stations in along the coastline so we can see into the South China Sea. Strategy. We're actually in an extremely good strategic position, probably the best position of any country on the planet. We're surrounded by open ocean for 1,000 kilometres in every direction to the north, south, no, to east, south and west. And we've got a 300 kilometre maritime gap between us and Timor on the main threat axis. We really are in a very good position. We can't rely on the US. They might go wacko again. Our only friends in the region are Japan, actually, who think like us. South Korea's very technologically advanced, but they're a bit wacko, people who deal with them, and they can't be relied upon. India can't be relied upon. Only Japan could be relied upon. And Japan and ourselves need nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them. We also should structure our force to project force to the Spratly Islands and the Chinese bases there to aid the Japan in their war in Northern Asia. Fuel supply. Australia burns about 1 billion barrels a day of oil. We only produce 100,000 barrels a day. The balance is imported from refineries in Asia, where the war will be fought. How we think anybody's going to get refined fuel from refineries in the war zone is just beyond me. We can make it in Australia if we convert coal into liquids, as the Germans did in World War II. South Africa still does. We use a process called Burgess. This is a diagram from his 1931 Nobel Prize acceptance speech, and from that you can figure out the mass balance equation. 1 kilo of coal will yield 1 litre of fuel. So you get a very low value solid, and you can turn it into a very high value liquid, and you do that by adding 5 kilos of hydrogen per tonne of coal. And I've done the work on it, and coupled with nuclear power to provide the electricity, instead of using process stream to make the hydrogen through steam reforming, use electrolysis of water, which means you can use cheap power at night when nobody else needs it and wants it, hydrogenate the coal and biomass, and you get directly. And you can scale this thing down to probably 5,000 barrels a day without much penalty economically. And you probably need 200 of those to make 1 billion barrels a day, which means that we also supply people in the region. All those countries out in the South Pacific who won't be getting fuel, they'll all be starving because they won't be able to put their fishing boats to sea and so on, and it'll all go dark in Fiji. Fuel supply is basically the oil price kept down by the US tight oil phenomenon, which is now peaking out. And this is also Chinese coal production in energy equivalent terms in barrels of oil. On to our industrial base. Now, is anybody here who believes in global warming and net zero? Well, their whole government's now thrashing the economy in the name of net zero and making us a lot poorer. But the closest historic analogy to what Australia's doing to itself is a South African tribe back in the mid-19th century of the Hosha. And what happened was these people have been farming cattle for thousands of years perhaps. They knew all about cattle. A teenage girl went down to the waterhole to get water. She came back and told the elders she'd had visions of the gods saying to them, we slaughter all our cattle and the gods will provide us with better cattle, more and better cattle. And scientific team was put together, a spiritual scientific, and they said, yep, we'll proceed with this. So they slaughtered all their cattle. 70% of the tribe died. And there's the plaque on her grave. This is what Australia is doing to itself with net zero, the closest historic analogy. Now, I've been involved in the whole global warming business now for 20 years odd, and I produced this graph down here way back when, saying, well, the heating from carbon dioxide is real, but it's minuscule. And I only put this in to say, 20 years later, 8 Taiwanese engineers, they came up with the same result, 0.3 of a degree centigrade. So it's not for lack of, it is for lack of trying, that we still believe, the powers that be in this country believe that global warming is happening and we need to thrash ourselves. At the same time, China, who is everybody's biggest enemy, this is current carbon dioxide emissions out of China versus the United States and European Union. China is putting more CO2 in the atmosphere than those two entities combined, and yet we're still doing it to ourselves. There's a discussion of some of the missiles we're buying. Bear in mind our Navy is buying these naval strike missiles from Kongsberg, and even the US Marine Corps, who has some of them, owns some of them, said, well, if the enemy is close enough that you can use them against them, that you're in a problem, you've got a problem. And a discussion of other missiles, which you can read in the PDF. This is US missiles in terms of cost on the x-axis and weight on the y-axis, and this is how they plot up. And interestingly, the most expensive ones all plot up on a straight line. And then if we plot dollars per kilo of those missiles versus weight of the missiles and compare them to the silver price, there's only 2 missiles that come in under the silver price in dollars per kilo. And bear in mind that 70 or 80% of a missile is either the explosive, which is probably $5 or $8 a kilo, or ammonium perchlorate, which you can buy online at $3 a kilo in bulk, but nevertheless, you're getting a 300-fold markup. Can we cut the cost of making missiles? Well, this is a very inspiring story. This is the cost of getting stuff into space in the US since 1960, and it's been very flat for decades. Along comes SpaceX, and he gets the price down to 1/10 of what it had been. We can do the same things in all the battlefield consumables. On that subject, a few years ago, we started making artillery shells in a plant in Maryborough, 155mm shells. Turns out we only make the case. We don't make all the other things necessary to actually use it. So this is a US diagrammatic of that's a shell, that's what we make in Maryborough. We don't make the fuse, we don't make the explosive you fill it with, we don't make the repellent, we don't make the primer. This is an idiotic situation that we've ended up with. And this is just to say you can use a lot less shells if you put a course correction fuse or precision guidance kit on the front end. It's about 2 kilos worth, and you stop this dispersion with distance. And that's the Israeli version, but the Yanks will sell them to you for $9,000 for about 2 kilos. Once again, if we want to make cruise missiles, we need to make these sort of things, cheap cruise missiles in Australia. 9 kilos for 50,000 Aussie, that's $5,500 a kilo. It shouldn't be any more than $100 a kilo for what it is. This is a good concept we should copy, to simply transfer all our missiles to fit into 20-foot containers and make the missiles fit the logistics system that's already out there in mass in the civilian world, which means every flatbed truck can be converted to a missile truck. This is to say that the Germans thought of first, of course, in World War II, the way to get range and get range cost effectively on your missiles is to stick wings on them. So the original V1 got to 400 kilometres. By adding wings to it, they got that 600 kilometres. But at one stage, they were planning to bomb New York from Germany, 4,500 kilometres. This is what you need to make missiles. You need someone actually to make the motors. Should be in a separate plant instead of having 30 different plants making the solid rocket motors. This is what they're doing in the United States. Anduril's making a solid rocket motor factory. You also need planetary mixers to mix all the explosives and the propellant up in the right proportions, evenly. Let's talk about the Russian experience. Soviet Union used to spend 20% of its GDP on defence. Had a whopping great military enterprise, and it settled down there. After that, didn't want to spend more than 5% of GDP on defence. This is the work breakup of making ICBMs at the crash mass plant. So this is an indication of what you need to do to be a precision-guided munition manufacturer. Over there, to make an ICBM, 40% of the effort's put into machining, 5% is casting, then you machine it, and then 20% in assembly. So 2/3 of the process is very simple, repetitive labour. In fact, the Russians have imported 1,000 Ugandan females for their weapons factories. Uganda has only got an IQ of 76 on average. So that's only 7 IQ points above retarded, and you can still be making precision-guided munitions because it's basic repetitive stuff. To make munitions, you need computer numerically controlled machines, and these are the countries that are making them. So you'll be basing out of Germany or Japan or South Korea or Taiwan. The Russians started their war in Ukraine without enough missiles, without enough CNC machines. So over the last 3 years, the number of CNC machines imported to Russia's gone up 5-fold. Now, traditionally they haven't bought out of China because Chinese machines are considered to be low quality. And the Russians are even going into China now and buying 20-year-old Japanese machines to get the critical mass they need. As I said, it's quite easy. Now we have to get a defence industrial base. We have to start letting contracts. We have to make our own battlefield consumables. So this is an exercise on what's involved. If we want to make artillery shells, that's what we need per shell, and for missiles, those totals tell you. And most of making missiles is ammonium perchlorate. If you're not making that in bulk, well, let's put it a different way. The amount of ammonium perchlorate you're making determines how much explosive you can throw at the enemy. So you better start making a lot of it, and the binder to put it together, and the powdered aluminium, which is part of the fuel. I mean, nuclear imperative. We need to copy what France did in the 50s, the force de dissuasion. And we need to... France then said we need to kill 80 million Russians so they don't attack us. We need the same numbers. We need the ability to kill 80 million Chinese. Then they may not attack us. They'd quite casually kill 12 million Australians. And you can see by the morality of what they're doing to themselves and their neighbours around in Asia. That would probably cost about 8 million. And bear aware that both South Africa and Pakistan developed their nuclear weapons programs for an outlay of US $250 million. That's equivalent to what we spent on the no vote in that failed referendum, to put it into perspective. Trump has actually said, well, and other US officials said, let's lease out nuclear weapons to our friends. That could include us. All we can do is ask nicely. Poland's come to the same conclusion. That's the Pakistani weapons-grade plutonium breeder site. There's also a need to control COVID, but we won't cover that. You can read that in the PDF. And that's the last 4 books I published. Thank you for your attendance this afternoon, gentlemen. You probably know more about defence now than anybody else in the country.